Why did Jesus use a sheep illustration to represent people who will gain everlasting life? Undoubtedly, because of the desirable qualities literal sheep have. They're gregarious, having a liking for companionship. They don't like to be alone. And it's a good thing, because without the flock and the protection of the shepherd, they're defenseless if a lion or bear approaches. About all they can do is bleat, "Bah! Goodbye, little sheep." Another good quality is that sheep as a whole tend to be peaceful, inoffensive, very different from goats. As little boys, my brother and I would pet the goats that my grandfather had. But if we turned our backs on them, one would often sneak up behind us and butt us for no reason. These are some of the desirable characteristics that make sheep an appropriate illustration for good people. But the quality we especially want to focus on is identified at John chapter 10, verses 4 and 5. When he, that is the shepherd, has brought all his own out, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. They will by no means follow a stranger, but will flee from him, because they do not know the voice of strangers.
So as you've probably already surmised, this month's broadcast is going to be quite extraordinary. In fact, those of you who've watched it already, and I'm sure many of you watching will have watched it already, will know that Stephen Lett's talk is going to go into some incredibly culty terrain. But right from the outset, it's very clear that this is about control. Stephen Lett wants you all to be his sheep. He wants you to be compliant and subservient. And what's really interesting is that he's expecting this, in fact, demanding this, as someone who, in this very talk, is revealing himself to be an utter idiot.
They're defenseless if a lion or bear approaches. About all they can do is bleat, "Bah! Goodbye, little sheep."
I mean, what do you even say about this? This is, again, one of God's channel to mankind, one of 8 people on the planet. So there's nearly 8 billion people on the planet. Let's call it 8 billion. And of those 8 billion, there are 8 men, mostly white, as it turns out. There are 8 men who are most suited to delivering God's wisdom to mankind. So that's 1 in a billion. Stephen Lett is a 1 in a billion man. Well, I think he is a 1 in a billion man, but not for the reasons you would probably think. How do you take this man seriously? I'm sure there are many Jehovah's Witnesses who dote on his every word and will find reasons to respect him. But the more he toys with his audience like this, the more he speaks to them as though they are first graders, as though they are, frankly, stupid, the more it's going to niggle, you would like to think. The more Jehovah's Witnesses are going to think, this cannot be wisdom from God, from the all-wise, all-knowing creator of the universe. And before we move on to the next clip, I do just want to revisit this ridiculous anecdote involving Stephen and his brother.
As little boys, my brother and I would pet the goats that my grandfather had. But if we turned our backs on them, one would often sneak up behind us and butt us for no reason.
This is information that I do not need in my mind, Stephen Lett. You know, I need the space for pin numbers. I don't need to know that when you were younger, you and your brother Tim is the name of his brother, were butted by goats when you tried petting them. We all understand that that's something that goats do. And frankly, that thing about they butted us for no reason. So apparently they need a reason. Stephen and Tim, I'm going to do something to you now. I'm going to sneak up behind you and butt you. But don't worry, I've got a good reason.
Sheep listen to the voice of their shepherd and reject the voice of strangers. Regarding this quality of sheep, the September 1st, 2004 Watchtower said this: "A book on Bible lands relates that a visitor once claimed that sheep recognize their shepherd by his dress, not his voice. A shepherd answered that it was the voice they knew. To prove this, he exchanged clothing with a stranger. Dressed in the shepherd's garb, the stranger called the sheep, but they did not respond. They did not know his voice. Yet when the shepherd called them, though he was disguised, the sheep came at once." Please ask yourself, as one of Jehovah's figurative sheep, do I obediently respond to the voice of the fine shepherd and flee from the voice of strangers? Well, let's talk about this. The original stranger was Satan the devil. Like a ventriloquist, he made a serpent appear to talk, but the words were Satan's words. Satan thereby used his voice to slander Jehovah and deceive Eve. Today, Satan continues his work as an evil ventriloquist using not serpents, but human puppets to enunciate his voice, these acting as his agents, either wittingly or unwittingly.
Thank you for that warning, Stephen. So, Stephen Lett, governing body member, wants us to be on guard against agents of Satan. Yes, Satan is an evil ventriloquist. He's not a good ventriloquist. He's an evil ventriloquist. And he started being a ventriloquist in the Garden of Eden, of course, when he used a snake as a puppet. And I've actually talked about this before. If Tibor is gracious, a thumbnail will appear to Sushi 367, Did Satan Lie to Eve? I do take exception to Stephen's summary of what happened supposedly in the Garden of Eden, but rather than repeat myself, there is the Sushi if you're interested. And Stephen Lett is using the example of the Garden of Eden story to explain that Satan is still up to his old tricks today. He is effectively the puppet master. He is controlling the world. He is behind all sorts of nefarious schemes to undermine pure worship. And you'll have seen shown on the screen during the broadcast this image of Satan. If Tibor is gracious, we can take a look at a close-up. So this is an image from Jehovah's Witness publications showing Satan controlling his agents on earth from heaven. That's the image that Stephen Lett wants you to keep in your minds as his talk progresses. Because what he's doing really is talking about a bogeyman under the bed. He's talking about this hidden, concealed threat, this nefarious character who Jehovah's Witnesses should be scared of, should fear. But don't worry, Stephen Lett and his pals are riding to the rescue. They are the shepherd that the sheep should be listening to. And the whole talk really is based on the verse that was read earlier from John chapter 10, but they will by no means follow a stranger, but will flee from him, because they do not know the voice of strangers. So the voice of strangers is supposedly the voice of anyone who's critical of the organization, or anyone who encourages people to think for themselves, essentially. That's what we're going to see as this JW Broadcasting episode progresses. But before we move on to the next clip, I did just want to draw your attention to this quote from Christopher Hitchens, whose work I personally feel deeply indebted to in giving me the tools to really start thinking for myself. I guess that would make the late Christopher Hitchens an agent of Satan. But what he said about sheep, the sheep-shepherd dynamic, came back into my mind as I was watching Stephen Lett's words. You have Stephen Lett, this religious leader, this cultish charlatan, really, really wanting people to be sheep. And here's what Christopher Hitchens said about that. Shepherds don't look after sheep because they love them. Although I do think some shepherds like their sheep too much. They look after their sheep so they can first fleece them and second turn them into meat. That's much more like the priesthood as I know it. Isn't that true? I love how analogies can be turned around on people in this way. And this is especially the case with groups like Jehovah's Witnesses that use analogies all the time and lean on analogies as some kind of proof, as some kind of evidence that what they're saying is true. Well, analogies aren't proof in and of themselves. And once you drill down into some analogies, they start to unravel. In this case, Christopher Hitchens is right. You never see shepherds and sheep together because the shepherds just love being around sheep. Oh, I can't get enough of these sheep. I really want to be out in all weathers, putting up with all sorts of unpredictable behavior from my flock of sheep, because sheep can be very troublesome. I really want to deal with all these sheep issues for hours on end because I love sheep. No, that's not how it works. They're doing it because it's their job, and they're doing it because sheep are livestock, and livestock are there to be exploited.